The Unitarian Universalist Church of Ventura, California, presents a homily by Dr. Jim Hornstein, family practitioner, titled Good and Necessary Trouble, recorded on Sunday morning, August 2nd, 2020.
Good morning, and welcome to worship with the Unitarian Universalist Church of Ventura. We are a storytelling, learning, growing, and healing community of resistance and resilience. Our minister, the Reverend Dana Warsnop, is away today. I am Worship Associate Jim Merrill, and I'm joined by Worship Associate Sue Brinkmeyer and a whole team of folks who have collaborated to bring this service into being, including our guest presenter, Dr. Jim Hornstein. You'll hear more about him in a while. Here is the lineup of our entire tech team. Today, our director is Brian Fortune, and our assistant director is Kitty Merrill. Today's magician, who has done many of our graphics, is also Kitty Merrill. Ordinarily, we have Joe Osborne available for tech support, but I'm not sure if he's here today. So let's be a community, and if you have technical problems, talk to yourselves in chat and see if you can help each other out. I remind you to stay muted unless you are in a breakout room. I also remind you, if you have not already done so, to join in making our online community more inclusive by adding your pronouns along with your name if you are joining us by Zoom. For example, I use the pronouns he, him. My colleague today, Sue Brinkmeyer, uses the pronouns she, her. You might use other pronouns such as they, them, or others. All are welcome. It is really so good to be together again. Let us enter sacred space.
Good morning. I'm Worship Associate Sue Brinkmeyer. We're hoping everyone here has a chalice or a candle and something to light it with. Let's all light our chalices together. Come, let us worship together. Each week, we give away our collection to an organization in the larger community or to funds that help people in our own church. You can donate to the cause at the link you'll see on the next slide or in the chat, or you can mail a check to the church. Our offering today goes to 805 Undocufund to assist local undocumented immigrant individuals and families who have suffered economic hardships due to the coronavirus. They do not qualify for federal stimulus dollars or expanded unemployment or for most state COVID-19 response programs, and the need is great. By April, more than 5,500 undocumented individuals were waiting for financial assistance due to COVID-19 layoffs or reductions in hours, and the numbers continue to grow, as do their needs. The father pictured here wrote to say that he used his offering or his donation to help his family buy food and buy clothing for his 3-month-old daughter. The mother you see here was thankful for the monetary assistance she used to pay the rent. 805 Undocufund is the only helpline available for so many of our undocumented neighbors. I hope you will give generously, as you always do. I invite you now into a time of silent meditation. You might want to settle more fully into wherever you are located. Perhaps place your feet fully on the floor and close your eyes. Breathe in, breathe out, a silent meditation.
Full disclosure, Dr. Jim Hornstein assisted in the births of both Aaron Merrill and Caitlin Merrill. In addition to those high qualifications, Dr. Hornstein is a family practitioner based in Ventura, certified in both family practice and in palliative care. He chairs the bioethics committees at both Community Memorial Hospital and the Ventura County Medical Center and its satellites. He participated in the statewide development of guidelines for the rationing of COVID-19 healthcare in the unhoped for event that such measures were to come to pass. Dr. Hornstein is constantly engaged in our community's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, he has taken time to be with us this morning. We began developing this service back in May with changing themes and titles. The social and medical landscape shifts daily these days. We are glad to present his most up-to-date observations, good and necessary trouble. Welcome, Dr. Jim Hornstein.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everyone. This past week, two things happened which I'd like to share with you. Well, first, grocery shopping in Ojai, I came across the following magazine. At first, I thought it was just a provocatively titled article, but then I realized it was actually the name of the magazine itself, a journal dedicated to helping you, to helping all people, quote, make better health choices, unquote, I guess by questioning your doctor's truthfulness, honesty, and candor. I'll talk more about that in a minute. A second thing which happened last week was the passing of Congressman John Lewis. Before being buried on Thursday, Representative Lewis became the first Black lawmaker to lie in state in the rotunda in the US Capitol. However, because of the COVID pandemic, there were no visitors allowed to be in there. But what they did do is replay one of his very famous speeches over and over again in the rotunda, and let me share it with you. And I quote, "You must find a way to get in the way. You must find a way to get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. Use what you have to make our country and make our world a better place where no one will be left out or left behind. It is your time," unquote. For me, that was really a great statement and a great quote. But what exactly did he mean by making good trouble, let alone by making necessary trouble? I can't say, even after studying it for a while, I'm exactly sure. But since I feel oddly challenged to respond to that Ojai magazine about what doctors don't tell you, this morning I'd like to talk with you about three things. First, I'm going to talk with you about a really bad case, a case exposing really bad trouble that happened in my beloved medical profession. Second, using the language that I have learned, the language of bioethics, I'll talk with you about what hopefully we've learned from our medical mistakes. And finally, how together you and I can work on making the necessary changes to help make our country, and in the words of John Lewis, our entire world, a better and kinder place. So let's start. The case I'd like to present this morning is a real case. This actually happened. And let me summarize the main points. The case is about an infectious disease which is rapidly spreading worldwide. There is no cure or vaccine available. The disease is fatal for some patients, disabling to others, and frankly, for some without symptoms. It disproportionately harms people of color, and the public health service is deeply involved in the pandemic, and the decisions that they make significantly impact the lives of all of us. Finally, in this case, the public's response has been a mixture of fear, anxiety, anger, blame, name-calling, and frankly, overt depression. Any of this sound familiar to any of you? Well, I'm not going to be talking about the current COVID virus vaccine pandemic, nor the COVID-19 epidemic. Although unfortunately from the summary, I certainly could be talking about that. I will also not be talking about the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, which unfortunately the case summary sadly also fits. What in fact I will be talking with you about goes back to an America of almost 100 years ago, to the nationwide syphilis epidemic of the 1920s. Now, it's fair for many of you to ask, why would I want to talk about something that happened over 100 years ago? And the answer, unfortunately, is because then, just like now, our nation, even 100 years ago, had to deal with the uncomfortable realities such as racism, social inequality, abuse of power, governmental mistakes, and the crucial need to never forget and never ignore basic human values. The formal case I wish to speak with you about is called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. It was run by the US government, exclusively by the US government, and began in 1932. You might ask, why was it done in the first place? And the answer is by 1926, almost 100 years ago, syphilis was a major health problem with over 1/3, 35% of all people of reproductive age infected. By contrast, if we look at the coronavirus of today, even with what we've been doing over the last 5 to 6 months, less than 2% of the American public has been infected. At that time in the 1920s, 35% of all people of reproductive age were infected. The study I'd wish to talk with you about took place in Tuskegee, Alabama, an isolated rural part of Alabama, and all of the test subjects were poor Black men. For them, in exchange for free medical exams, free food, and free burial insurance, 600 Black men were enrolled in the study, 399 men with syphilis, 201 without. The study was only to be run for 6 months, but bizarrely, and in fact, it lasted over 40 years, from 1932 through 1972. Now, just to remind you, syphilis is an infection caused by a bacteria easily treated today with penicillin. But let me also remind you that in 1932, when the study started, penicillin, or for that matter, any antibiotics, were not yet available to treat anybody. It wasn't until the mid-1940s that penicillin became widely available to treat many infections, including syphilis. By the way, in 1945, Dr. Alex Fleming, a Scottish physician, received the Nobel Prize for delivering this life-saving drug. Unfortunately, none of the doctors, none of the nurses, none of the medical students or residents, none of the pharmacists or public health officials ever offered penicillin to treat any of the infected Black men in the Tuskegee experiment. They did not treat them for the remainder of the entire 1940s, even though the medicine was available and readily available. Not for the entire decade of the 1950s, not even for the entire decade of the 1960s. And let me remind you, because they were not offered antibiotic treatment ever during this study, some of the men eventually died of their disease. Some developed irreversibly brain damage. Some infected their wives or their girlfriends, and some had their newborn babies contract syphilis at birth. Finally, thank God, in 1972, an investigative reporter broke the story, and amid widespread protests, the Tuskegee experiment was finally halted. Remember, despite having a simple and cheap treatment, penicillin, for almost 30 years, the US government, my fellow physicians, nurses, and public health professionals withheld needed treatment from those Black patients, leading to needless personal suffering and death. Finally, in 1997, 25 years after this experiment stopped, President Bill Clinton apologized to the surviving Black patients, their spouses, and their families, and in fact to the entire nation, for a 40-year study which was not only ethically wrong, but ethically unjustified from the very beginning. Now, I bring up this horrible story in medicine because, like today, too often in American history, progress is made after unbelievably bad events. Take, for example, the life and experiences of Congressman John Lewis. Here he is on this week's cover of Time magazine, printed just a few days ago. Congressman Lewis was born in the tiny town of Troy, Alabama, and ironically, he grew up only 50 miles from Tuskegee, Alabama, which also was ironic that he was born around the same time as this so-called study. Representative Lewis was born to sharecropper parents, and his great-grandfather was born a slave. He was exposed to horrific events of the Jim Crow era South, including the realities of persistent racism, forced segregation, and even lynchings. But despite the violence and hatred surrounding him, Representative Lewis chose a very different path, the path of it being a non-violent activist. Because of his activism, he was arrested nonetheless 45 times in his life and beaten repeatedly by police and white supremacists, most famously in 1965, when he led 600 people across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, in support of voting rights for all of us. At that time, he was beaten unconscious and sustained a near fatal skull fracture. Yet the nonviolent protests of that bloody Sunday march led directly to a change in American views on the moral power of peaceful protests. And soon after that protest, the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act occurred. Something good coming from something very bad also happened in my field, the field of bioethics, partly driven by the medical abuses and institutionalized racism of the Tuskegee experiment. By the late 1970s, my young field of bioethics was actually born. What I teach today to young doctors at Community Memorial Hospital and the Ventura County Medical Center, and in fact, the values and principles of bioethics practice in every hospital, in every city, in every state in America today, those core values, believe it or not, were only codified in 1977, a mere 3 years after the story I just told you about what happened in Tuskegee. And I believe those bioethical principles are actually worth remembering and discussing this morning, not because they are unique to medicine, because these values can and should be shared with all persons trying to make our world a better and kinder place. Frankly, people from what I see like you. There are only 4 core bioethics values, and I'll present them one at a time. First, respect and dignity for all persons. In medicine, we believe that all patients have the right to make their own healthcare decisions based upon their own values and their own goals. This principle is equally true, however, for all of us. In our Constitution, it states all persons have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of their own dreams and their own life goals. It is the same goal that we have in medicine and that we share as citizens. The second core value is to promote the best interests of other people. Again, in medicine, the needs of the patients come first, not the needs of the insurance company, the HMO, the experimenter in an experiment, or frankly, anyone else. It is a doctor's sworn duty to promote the best interests of their individual patients. Frankly, that's one of the reasons I bristled at that magazine I read this week, What Doctors Don't Tell You. And the reason is this, because by definition, it's unethical for me or any doctor not to tell you things which could help you live a better, healthier, and longer life. But thinking beyond medicine, shouldn't all of us try to make the lives of our kids, of our parents, of our neighbors, of the disadvantaged, of the hungry, of the homeless, of the poor, shouldn't we try to make their lives a little better too? Shouldn't we promote the best interest of the other? The third bioethics principle is to help people avoid preventable harms. In my field of medicine, this dates back to the Hippocratic maxim, primum non nocere, above all, do no harm. But for the rest of us, shouldn't it also be a first principle that we don't harm other people? Isn't it time that in our country, at this time, it is never okay to bully or harass another person? Isn't it finally time that in our country, no person ever deserves to have his neck crushed by another person's knee? The fourth and final principle is to promote justice. In medicine, ethical practice demands that all doctors be fair, unbiased, evidence-based, truthful, and treat all people equally. But isn't that true for the rest of us? Doesn't it mean exactly the same thing? For all of us, isn't it time now we all act in a fair, unbiased, and just way? John Lewis said in his speech at the rotunda where he lied in state, "It is now our time." I'd like to conclude by returning to the state of Alabama, to Tuskegee, and also to Troy. The Tuskegee experiment was not just an admission of decades of medical mistakes and a reckoning of institutional racism. It was also an example of what can happen when people, good people, forget their shared values and their shared moral beliefs. Representative John Lewis spent his entire life and his entire career lovingly reminding us of that fact. While Representative Lewis lived through many dark moments during our American experience, he refused to be broken. He refused to be defeated. He believed that with goodness, faith, and holding strong, stable values, that all of us can change for the better, and that change was always possible. For me, the legacy of Congressman John Lewis, both as a doctor and frankly, as a citizen like we all are, I think it is all time for us to recommit to our shared core values and to find ways to collectively do good trouble, necessary trouble, and work together to make our country and our world a better, healthier, and happy place. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I honor Representative John Lewis, and I think we can all honor Representative Lewis by voting in the election this November. For him and for all of us, it is in fact the greatest example of nonviolent change available to all of us as American citizens. My friends, stay healthy, stay kind, and good Sabbath.
Please join me in extinguishing your chalices at home. We extinguish the chalice, but not the light in our hearts or the wisdom and commitment to one another we have strengthened here. Those we take out into the world until we meet again.
May you be well. May we be well and healed. May we manifest the Hebrew notion of tikkun olam. May our actions heal the world. May it be so.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Good and Necessary Trouble, presented by Dr. Jim Hornstein, recorded on August 2nd, 2020, for the Unitarian Universalist Church of Ventura, California.